Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to give it another minute. We still have some people logging on, so I'll just give it another minute and we will start the webinar. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today for the latest in DecuSoft's webinar series, Introduction to Executive Compensation, the Fundamentals. I'm Leslie O'Connell. I'm the AVP of Sales here at DecuSoft, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we begin, I wanted to quickly review a few housekeeping issues. All attendees will be on mute. Please use the question box at the bottom right half of the screen, the GoToMeeting screen, to submit any questions that you have. And you can submit your questions at any time during the presentation. We will be recording today's session, and everyone will receive a copy of the recording. We have quite a large number of people on the phone with us today. If we do not get to all your questions, please keep submitting. We will answer them offline via email after the presentation to the audience. Okay, I wanted to start off by giving you a little background on our companies. DecuSoft, we're the producers of Compose, which is a compensation management software solution. Compose works in conjunction with your HCM system and helps to automate and simplify the administration of your compensation programs. And to quote one of my customers who says it best, Compose provides the functionality you would expect in a robust compensation software program. So we're proud to be hosting Joseph Sorrentino and Stephen Hall today of Stephen Hall & Partners, which is an independent compensation consulting firm specializing in the areas of executive compensation and related corporate governance issues. They've been providing their clients with the highest quality of expertise and counsel on executive comp since 2005. They are nationally recognized. They have offices in New York City, and they also serve clients throughout the United States and around the world. So with that, I think we're in for a great presentation today, and I'm going to hand the floor over to Joseph and Stephen.
Thank you, Leslie. We are excited to join DecuSoft today on this webinar. We get asked a lot of technical questions on various topics of the complex world of executive compensation. And as we were discussing potential topics with Leslie, something that came up is, it would really be helpful for someone who is new to the executive compensation world or someone who's looking to expand their skill set and grow into the executive compensation space. Provide something that really gives you a good foundation for what some of the key issues are and building blocks. So that's really the intent of this program. So we're going to kick it off here. And in general, what we're going to talk about today is the environment that we're facing as it relates to executive compensation, the compensation philosophy, which is an important stake in terms of developing an exec comp program, the components of executive compensation and how they are utilized within a comprehensive program. And then we're going to end with some important governance policies that everyone on the line should be aware of, and we are also pleased to take questions. We're going to take some a little bit midway through, and then at the end, and as Leslie mentioned, we're happy to follow up individually with any additional questions that may come. So if we think about where we stand today, executive compensation has a lot of forces that are being pushed and impact within our environment. If you are internal, obviously you need to focus from a management perspective on the key objectives of the program and designing and implementing executive compensation programs and policies and procedures that will lead to effective performance and in the end lead to shareholder value creation. The board and the compensation committee is in charge of overseeing the executive compensation role and approving and recommending the programs and the quantum of pay. We've had experiences that where management and the compensation committee work very well together, and we've had experiences where there's been some push and pull and challenges. And I think part of making sure there is that everyone gets to a place that they're comfortable with is open communication and understanding what the overall objectives are. We unfortunately have quite a bit of quote-unquote corporate governance advocates that have their own agendas, from advisory firms that will recommend voting for say on pay, which is a non-binding vote, but taken very seriously and has a tremendous impact on how compensation programs have been modified and designed over the last several years. Regulators, both in general from an SEC perspective and specific to some industries such as financial services or healthcare, also have significant influence in terms of some of it from an overseeing perspective and some of it just general guidelines and principles. And then the media. Unfortunately, you don't see a whole lot of articles in front page of major publications that talk about, hey, this company is really doing executive compensation right, and you tend to see more of a gotcha. So our job as consultants and for everyone on the phone that have the internal role, it's keep the company out of the headlines of the negative policies or the negative press, and how do we go about doing that? And that's some of the stuff we're going to cover today. I think it all starts from a philosophy perspective, and any good philosophy will lay out the objectives. So it's pretty common that kind of mom and apple pie that public companies in the U.S. will talk about attracting, motivating, retaining, and rewarding talent. Alignment of pay with performance. You're going to hear a lot of discussion in this webinar about aligning pay and performance and what that really means, because unfortunately it means different things for different constituencies. And since the collapse and recession due to the financial markets back in the 08-09 timeframe, we've seen a lot more of discussion around ensuring that the exec comp programs do not encourage excessive risk-taking. Pay mix is a big issue, and because of all the tools in the toolkit and how the programs are designed, there are various decision points that have to be made from a fixed versus variable perspective, short-term versus long-term, and cash versus equity. And these mixes are specific to companies in terms of where you may want to position yourself, but also can be unique to an industry and to the life cycle of an organization. And then pay positioning. Everyone wants to be competitive with the market. You need to define what that market is. And traditionally we talk about we're going to target to median levels of pay. So you hit your performance targets and you're going to get roughly median payouts compared to market. But also I think it's important to remember that you need flexibility within your program designs. Flexibility can mean doing something unique for a business unit that is focused on something outside of the corporate perspective, to incent new product development, for example, or a new strategy within an organization. It can mean knowing that you need to go above and beyond what is target market median for certain individuals who are viewed as high demand, with strong performers. So I think when we talk about pay positioning, overall remembering there has to be some flexibility built into the system is pretty key. Stephen now is going to take us through the components of a good executive compensation program and dive into some of the areas to think about here.
Great. Thanks a lot, Joe. So as Joe said, we've just kind of looked at executive compensation from sort of the 35,000 foot view and looking down as to positioning and other things to be considering. We're going to drill down into the different components now. And when we think about an executive compensation program, there are typically sort of 5 buckets that your compensation would fall into. Those would be your salary, your annual incentives, which everyone would probably call their annual bonus, your long-term incentives, and that includes everything from long-term equity awards and can include some long-term cash awards. Your retirement benefits, this would be things like 401k, the senior executive retirement plans that typically will go above and beyond a 401k, and in very rare circumstances, pension type plans for executives. And finally, we look at other benefits and perquisites. These are diminishing and are almost non-existent, but they would include things like the company car, like your health care, your health club dues, and for generally only CEOs, use of the corporate aircraft. When we think about each one of those different buckets and what do they do to attract, retain, and motivate your current executives, we kind of laid out what we thought each of the different elements did for that. You'll notice that salary, annual incentives, and long-term incentives are generally high to moderate. Places where that deviates would be your salary. That's not a highly motivational factor because it's not going to change mid-year unless you have a change in responsibilities or a promotion. Typically, changes to your salary happen on an annual basis after that big, long annual review is done. Likewise, if you look at annual incentives, we have moderate for retain. I don't know that any executive won't jump ship for another offer that might be better just because they're waiting on their bonus to pay out. While it definitely helps retain and keep them there, any company that wants that individual is going to make them an offer that would incorporate any sort of bonus they're leaving behind. And finally, while long-term incentives has a high/moderate for motivate, the reason we put in that moderate is you can get awards that are time-based or service-vested restricted stock awards. And there are some in the governance community who don't view these as paying for performance. They view them akin to base salary. Although we don't think that's completely fair, there's still stock price movement to consider, and the value of those awards are subject to that movement. As you can see down the bottom, the retirement benefits and the other benefits and perks are typically sort of your low to moderate in terms of attracting, retaining, and motivating. Like I said, perquisites are almost all gone, so they don't do much for either of these 3 categories. So we're going to take a look now at base salary. I think everyone's pretty familiar with how a base salary works. It's what's set at the beginning of the year for each of these executives. It provides a stable source of income that even if no bonus is paid and all your equity awards become worthless, you have enough money to pay the mortgage and pay for the kids' tuition, kind of thing. It's generally a small percentage of overall compensation. You'll see those in proxy statements where pie charts are developed for what part of total compensation is made up of either fixed or base salary. It's very small, but it has a lasting impact on all the other pieces of compensation because your base salary is used to set your target bonus and is generally used to set your target long-term incentives, as these are set up as a percentage of salary. So any change that you make to the salary is going to resonate through the rest of the program. It'd be very rare to see a salary go up, but any of these target percentages come down. So a change, an increase in your base salary will increase your target bonus, will typically increase your long-term incentive target. A few things to consider with base salary are, as we mentioned, adjustments are typically not made sort of on the fly during the year. You will typically see them being made after an annual review is done or after there's some promotion or significant change in responsibilities for the executive. Another thing to consider with base salary is the disclosure. So for your top executives, they're going to show up in the proxy statement under the compensation discussion and analysis report. And we find that having a rationale for where your base salaries are set can be a useful sort of opening dialogue with either your shareholders or some of the advisory firms. Stating that you are pegging to a certain percentile in the market can be helpful. Defending that positioning is definitely helpful. And all of this should be considered in good times, but certainly in bad. If your performance is not matching those of your competitors, you may want to have a bit of a further discussion or defense of why you set pay the way it is. And the final thing to consider is the 162M $1 million cap. So under 162M, companies can't take a tax deduction for compensation that is not performance-based over this $1 million threshold. And that excludes your CFO, but it includes your CEO and other proxy officers. The one thing to consider there is while base salary does not count as performance-based, neither do things like the time-vested restricted stock awards that we'll talk about in the future. So when you're setting your base salary, if you have it set at $1 million, anything above and beyond that is not performance-based, you won't be able to take a tax deduction on. We'll go a little bit more into 162M in the annual incentive section. So now let's talk about some annual incentives or your annual bonus. This is the compensation that you get paid at the end of the year for the one-year performance period. We typically see that companies and compensation committees like to focus executives using the annual incentive plan by picking specific metrics that they think are going to help grow the business and will follow the business plan that's been approved by the board of directors. The best annual incentive plans, typically ones that follow the approved business plan in lockstep. It's good for communication both internally and externally. And the other feature of a bonus plan is that it has the opportunity for, the opportunities are listed as a percentage of base salary. So as I mentioned before, as your base salary will increase, typically your target bonus will be increasing. When we look at the different metrics that companies have been selecting, earnings is by far the most prevalent. The study that this is referencing looked at almost 900 companies with revenues between $1 and $5 billion. And we find that over 87% of companies are using some form of earnings. This can be operating income, your different EBITs, EBITDAs, EPS, earnings per share. And after that, prevalence drops pretty quickly for things like revenue. Individual performance can be anything from one or two different goals that you give an individual, all the way to an individual executive scorecard with many different metrics that focus both on sort of their own performance as well as maybe divisions that they have supervisory roles to. And I'll just point out the very last metric that we listed on this chart is stock performance. Only 3% of companies mention that they use some form of stock performance in their annual bonus plan. As the 3% would sort of indicate, it's very rare to see something like that. We typically would like to look for metrics that we think executives have the ability to influence over a one-year period, and stock price performance can be a bit of a lagging indicator for changes that are being made within a company. Now we showed you all what the metrics that are being used are. Now comes the fun part, which is goal setting. It's probably one of the most difficult and complicated processes that you see a committee go through and management go through as well. The downturn that happened back in 08, 09 really kind of flipped a bunch of plans where there were zero payouts, even though executives were working hard to sort of, keep their head above water, keep the company's head above water. But it provided an environment where it was very difficult to forecast future performance, not just for 1 year, but in some cases we were hearing where a company couldn't predict where they would be in 6 months. So you found a lot of different ways that was being handled with multiple shorter plans that were only looking at 3 to 6 month periods. We've kind of moved back to looking at annual performance, as I think some of that budgeting has gotten better. Generally, we look for goals to be realistic, motivational, and as I've mentioned before, they should reflect the company's business plan that's already been worked on and approved by the board of directors. It should definitely be cognizant of any communication that's being provided outside to Wall Street or other stakeholders in the company. If there's going to be a drastic change from the previous year's performance, I think that requires a little bit of communication from the company and the board, both internally and externally, so that there's not a surprise if there either is or is not a payout because performance was worse than last year or significantly better than last year. And finally, just keeping an eye on what else is happening in your specific industry, what your direct competitors are doing. While that shouldn't dictate what you do, it's probably helpful to know as you're designing your plans. This way there are no surprises in the future one way or another. Finally, the different larger shareholders and proxy advisory firms are really pushing for more disclosure on goals. They're looking for specifics of what was the target, what were the performance minimums and maximums. Companies have been reluctant to disclose this in the past, citing that it would do harm to them and take away competitive advantage. We're finding there's a lot more pushback now from these different shareholders and advisory firms that, no, you got to put it in the proxy, we want to see it. Additionally, a lot of these firms are also doing their own pay-for-performance analysis on your plan. So while you may think that you've set a great goal and that your performance justifies the level of payout that you're providing, you also now have these other firms, such as ISS, Glass Lewis, performing their own pay-for-performance. They're not necessarily using the performance metrics you've picked or the goals that you've set, and they're giving you a grade as to how you are doing compared to your performance. So I think you just also have to keep in mind that you have other eyes looking over your shoulder at your plan as you're running through it.
I think communication here is key, both internally, so you set appropriate expectations for your management team, and externally. And the process of looking backwards as to what historical levels look like, looking forwards to what projections are both communicated to the outside world as well as internally, and looking around in terms of industry averages and direct competitors where data is available is key and can help in terms of justifying the goals that were set when you are discussing the annual incentive plan in your proxy and discussing them with your major shareholders.
So as I mentioned with annual incentives, there's this idea of your target. It's set as a percentage of your base salary. You would typically see something around like 100% of base salary for a CEO of a corporation. But there's also different markers set up for performance below target as well as above target. And those are either your minimum and threshold on the low end. That's typically the lowest amount of performance that you would be willing to pay a bonus for, is sort of the way to think of it. If you set, that operating income needs to be $100 for the year, just to do easy math, at what point would you not want to be paying a bonus to these executives? So you set that as your threshold, and then typically you would pay a bonus that is less than target. Typically you see it's between 25 and 50% when we look at these different plans. On the other side, you have maximum. Performances, they knocked it out of the park, did a really great job, and at some point you're going to stop paying for additional performance. This would be viewed as, this is exceptional performance. You typically see that a maximum is somewhere between 150 and 200% of base salary. And like I said, you're not going to pay for any additional performance. This is a bit of a risk mitigator. This way, executives aren't pushing too fast, too hard, and trying to do too much that may be viewed as risky behavior either internally or externally. So if we take those sort of three different outcomes, there's a general rule of thumb as to the probability of attainment. You should be hitting your minimum or threshold performance 9 out of 10 times. It should be, while not a slam dunk that you're always going to make that performance metric, it should be easy enough to generally achieve 9 out of 10 years. With maximum, we think that that's something that generally you hit 1 out of every 10 years. It should be a difficult mark to hit, but on the average of 10 years, you'll find that the company is achieving it at least once. And with the other remaining 8 years, you typically, it'll be between that threshold and maximum, and you generally like to see that the payouts are really clustered around that target payout level.
This is an area we spend a lot of time with clients in terms of goal setting. If you look back in history and a plan has not paid out for a number of years, or then you're really questioning the incentive of the plan for participants. And on the flip side, if there is maximum payouts being reached, 3 years in a row, for example, then you're likely to start getting some pushback from your board and your comp committee as it relates to, are we just setting goals too low, or these layups? Now, in some cases, it may be that the management is just doing a superior job, and they've been exceptional over this time frame. But it does call into question. So I think having some general rule of thumbs that we put together here, and based on our experience and based on our discussions over time with clients, is helpful to have in your head. And as a practitioner, I think looking back and understanding the history of the payouts for your short-term bonus plan is helpful as you're thinking about, is it truly working, or do we need to do anything to perhaps improve the program?
So sort of taking that idea and putting it into chart form, this would be a pretty typical payout curve for an annual bonus plan. In this case, we're probably looking at something based on earnings, based on the different performance levels on the x-axis. So in this situation, if you achieved that $90 of operating income, to go back to my last example, you had to at least achieve $90 of operating income to start receiving a bonus. In this case, it would be 50% of the target bonus. When you get up to that $100 of operating income, you receive your target bonus. And if you're able to overachieve and get $110 of operating income, you're going to get paid 200% of your target bonus. You can see that the slope of the payout curve after target increased. So for every added dollar of operating income, you were getting almost twice as much added bonus than you were between the threshold and target positionings.
And the theory there is a dollar earned is harder to achieve when you're above target. So each incremental dollar is more valuable to the participants.
Now, as we talked about in the past, there's been some difficulty with goal setting. And I think one way that companies can handle that is by using an alternative payout curve like the one shown here. In this case, you see that the target payout area is sort of spread out into a range. Also, payouts start much earlier in terms of 80% of target performance, and pay all the way up to 120% of target performance. The reason for doing this is if you're having difficulty with goal setting, if there's some unexpected moves anticipated and you don't know how those are going to relate to financial performance, you might want to give yourself a little bit of leeway, both up and down, so that, again, your plan doesn't become, doesn't lose its motivation mid-year for the executives. And finally, as I mentioned before with 162M, this is a very important consideration for your annual bonus plan. Typically, we find the companies want to make sure that their bonuses are 162M compliant. Here we've listed sort of 5 main criteria that the plan needs to have in order to achieve this 162M compliance. It needs to be a plan that was approved by shareholders. It needs to have objective performance criteria, and these criteria need to be set up by the outside and independent directors on an annual basis. The compensation committee needs to verify in writing the amounts that were paid and the goals were achieved. This is typically done in the proxy statement under the compensation discussion and analysis report. And also, one important factor is that the plans can only provide for negative discretion. The compensation committee only has the ability to decide on its own to reduce a bonus payment. They cannot go in after a plan has been set and has an outcome and decide to increase that payment. They would lose their 162M compliance in that situation. And finally, the plan must be reapproved every 5 years by shareholders. And with that, we will we will take a brief pause and see if there are any questions.
Hi, yes, this is Leslie. There are a couple of questions, and I just want to remind the audience that if you have any questions, please type them into the question box on the GoToMeeting control panel. Our first question, how do you see discretion used in annual incentive programs?
Well, like I said, I think in general, you'll find that companies are only using this sort of negative discretion. They definitely want to make sure that they keep their 162M compliance. One way that you can work around this is doing something called a plan within a plan. The way that would work is you would set you would basically set a maximum payout that is allowed under the plan if certain performance criteria are met, and then you would use a different formula to come in and figure out the exact payout that's going to be made as long as it is less than that original maximum. They're a little bit more complex, but we definitely see those out there as a way to provide for sort of a positive discretion by sort of making the second plan within the plan.
Yeah, I think positive discretion is, you're really subjecting yourself to increased scrutiny from your institutional shareholders, from proxy advisory firms. If they see, there's a negative connotation there. So if they see discretion, they assume it's really just because the goals weren't hit, and you wanted to make sure that you paid your executives. Kind of a tails I win, heads I win idea and concept. So I think if there is a strong rationale for increasing the bonus payout, you really have to do a good job of telling your story in the proxy, and try to be as clear as possible as to why it was critical to make this adjustment.
And you'll still probably get people recommending against your spam table.
Okay, next question. Do you lose the tax exemption on the entire salary or just the amount over $1 million?
It's just the amount over $1 million.
Okay.
And it's also important to remember as we transition to long-term that, as Stephen talked about earlier, plain vanilla time-vested restricted stock also does not count. So when you think about what your basis is for your proxy officers in terms of versus that $1 million, it's not just salary, it's also any time-vested restricted stock that vests in that year. That said, many companies, particularly very large firms, have gotten comfortable with having salaries over $1 million. So, the GEs of the world have salaries for the CEO in excess of $1 million at this point. So they're comfortable with losing that tax deduction under the, the idea that it's competitiveness that is more important than losing that a little bit, and it's not really meaningful. But it's a signifier and an indicator.
Okay, so we have several more questions. We'll take a couple of more and then I guess move on. The next question would be, what would be your top 3 pieces of advice to comp committee members approaching a possible change in control, sale of the company, for example, in the next 12 months?
Number 1 is understand the potential payouts due to your management team. And that's going to take a lot of work from internally with the HR staff to gather all the relevant materials, so employment agreements, severance documents, equity awards, and try and develop. What you're afraid of is the holy cow number. And you're going to see large numbers with major M&A deals. However, it is absolutely imperative that the HR team, as well as from a consultant perspective, if we're working, that the comp committee understands the quantum, and they understand by individual what it means. Number 2, I think, is look at, an assessment of internal versus external. So what is our agreements, what are the severance multiples, and what does that look like versus the market? And is there any shortfalls there? So our policies and programs and provisions related to change of control, is that competitive? And number 3 is, and probably should be number 1 as I think about it, is understanding your retention risks and who potentially could go under various merger transactions and deals, and do you need to do anything special to ensure that you have the glue in place to keep your critical talent both on an operational perspective as before a deal, And then if there's something announced and now you're entering a time where it's super risky and maybe easier if somebody is potentially thinking about jumping ship during that transition period, it's a lot easier for them to say it's, you know, I'm going to go. So I think it's absolutely imperative to make sure that you have a strong retention program in place.
You also need to keep focused on sort of your current plan that's going on, because, you know, at any minute we've seen deals evaporate, and you don't want to be left there thinking that you did not provide for either the current year, and executives might still have a bit of that retention worry because, oh, the deal didn't go through, you know, now what are we going to do? So just making sure that whatever plan was in place prior to an announcement of a deal is still running, still operational, I think is also important. And with that, I think we'll move on here and go on to long-term incentives.
So long-term incentives, I think, are the most critical component of executive pay these days. It has the highest weighting if you're thinking about mix. If you think about it in terms of a pie, if you're looking at 50 to 60% of a CEO's pay is made up of long-term incentives. Direct reports below the CEO are, you know, it's 40 to 60%, I would say. So a whole lot is riding on the design of a long-term incentive program. Just in terms of, you know, setting the stage, LTI are awards that are earned and paid based on achievement of goals over a period exceeding 1 year. Goals can be stock price or business performance. Usually we're talking about equity here, but there are some firms for a variety of reasons who use cash. And when we think about the purpose and the objectives, it's pretty similar to when we started at the beginning of the webinar and talked about compensation philosophy. We want to attract, retain, and motivate. We want to align the interests of executives and shareholders. We want to focus participants on the critical performance criteria. Competitiveness of pay is super critical here since LTI is such a large component. And this is really your wealth creation vehicle. When we think about long-term, we're basically thinking about 3 types, and those are appreciation vehicles, such as stock options or stock-settled appreciation rights, SARs. These are awards where there's only value delivered to the participant if the stock grows from the date of grant. If so, there'll be an exercise price for an option. If the stock goes down, that's when we talk about underwater stock options, where the exercise price is greater than the stock price on the current stock price. SARs work the same way in theory as options, but when they're settled for stock, you're only delivering the profit in shares, so they're less dilutive than options. We have time-vested, full-value vehicles, so these are your restricted stock or restricted stock units. These vest just plain vanilla over time. Usually we see a 3 or 4 year time frame, either pro rata on anniversaries of the grant date or cliff, 100% at the end of a certain time period. And then we have performance vested vehicles. These usually are similar in it's a share or a unit, so very similar to restricted stock, but you need to do something in addition to the time component. You need to hit some sort of performance criteria. I want to spend a few seconds on the pros and cons of each of these type of vehicles. So stock options, you have alignment with shareholders. They're easy to communicate both internally and externally. You have leverage in that options are not worth as much of a share because they're only an appreciation vehicle, so you need to grant more of them. So if you were trying to grant $1,000 worth and your stock price was $10, well, you can just grant 100 restricted stock, but you have to grant more than 100 stock options to grant equivalent value. And it's fixed from an expense perspective. And that means that companies are taking a Black-Scholes or a binomial valuation to expense these over the vesting period. So there's not any variability there in terms of what the expense is going to be. On the negative side, something as a firm we don't agree with, but there are primarily ISS and Glass Lewis proxy advisory firms who don't view options as being performance-based. They are under the impression that a rising tide raises all ships, so therefore the stock options, unless they're premium priced, so it's set at an exercise price that's greater than the price on the data grant, or if there's performance kickers within the option itself, so it needs to vest not just over time but also based on performance, then you're not going to get credit for having a performance award through just plain vanilla stock options. They're not tied explicitly to the company financial performance. Stephen mentioned, you often have a lag in terms of operational performance versus stock price, so you don't have that immediate, in most cases, you don't have that immediate kind of performance alignment based on operations or your, what you're accomplishing in your accounting statements. There's dilution on the downside. We said you have to grant more options vis-a-vis restricted stock. From a leverage perspective, well, the downside of that is you are now diluting your shareholders more than you would with a full value share. And then, unfortunately, expense options are still expensed as long as they vest. So you may see no value as a participant if the options are never go above the strike price. However, the company is still taking that expense. Restricted stock has some similar pros as options in terms of they are easy to communicate, they have a fixed expense. Where we see restricted stocks used primarily is when there is a strong focus on retention. They're highly positive from a retention perspective because you're going to get these things as long as you are an employee in good standing. And unless the company goes bankrupt, they're going to be worth something. They may be worth less than what they were in the data grant. They're still going to be worth something. So that helps from a retention perspective. And it is aligned with shareholders in that if the stock price goes up from the data grant until vesting, you're going to have more than what you would have had. On the negative side, it can be viewed as pay for pulse. So again, if you just fog the mirror and you're there for 3 years, you're going to get your stock award vesting. You're also not tied to company financial performance, and there is not that leverage. So if you really exceed stock price performance over time, you're usually better off with options because you're going to have more of them. And then when we talk about performance vesting awards, and this is the area that we've seen the most movement in over the last few years as companies are increasingly focused on aligning pay for performance. And these are awards, again, you don't have that issue of, well, if you fog the mirror, you're going to get these. You actually have to do something. So the fact that there's performance associated with these awards make them pretty popular from an investment community perspective. You have a fixed expense in most cases if the performance goals are subject to operational performance. So if you don't meet those goals, then you will be able to recover the expense unless you're talking about stock price as the metric. And in most cases, you're talking about awards that are less dilutive vis-a-vis options. The negatives here, it can be difficult to set the performance criteria. All the challenges that are associated with setting goals for short-term plans that Stephen mentioned earlier. Multiply that by a factor of 10 when you're talking about setting things over what is typically a 3-year long-term performance period. If you don't do a good job in goal setting, your retention value goes away, and these things are going to be viewed as worthless by your participants, and that's a problem. And we also talked about the expense issue. If it's a market condition, which in essence is something based on stock price or total shareholder return, then you cannot reverse the expense here. So there's a possibility that you're using an inefficient vehicle from an accounting perspective. If we look at mix for long-term incentives, you'll see in the pie charts here, the one on the left, for the same group of companies that Stephen was sharing data with on the annual incentive side, the primary vehicle is performance-based, 41%, 37% in time-vested restricted stock, and 22% in stock options. Most companies are using 2 or 3 vehicles. Only 22% are using just one. The majority here are using 2. And I think that goes to the fact that long-term incentive vehicles have different positives, and depending on what you're trying to achieve, and usually you're trying to achieve multiple objectives, you really need more than one vehicle to make sure that you're hitting all of your goals from a retention perspective, from a performance perspective, and aligning performance. When we talk about metrics for performance awards, they should be aligned with the business strategy. They're very similar to our discussions on annual incentives. They should reflect the key drivers of corporate and shareholder value. It's important to think about the metrics and which performance criteria would create a clear line of sight for your employees to really focus their efforts and map their accountability. Metrics take the form of either absolute or relative. That is, either absolute, it can be viewed negatively by shareholders because you're not looking at it from a relative basis. It's just all based on the goal setting internally. And while relative is viewed more positively because it is versus some segment of the market, and it can also help because you're serves as a plug when you can't predict the absolute metrics. If we look at metrics versus our database here, most common is one performance metric in the CEO long-term incentive plan. That is, right now, TSR and stock price is the most predominant metric there, with earnings a little bit behind. And then you'll see it's primarily either stock price or earnings. It gets the vast majority. Spend just a few seconds on relative TSR, since it is the most popular LTI metric, and it's been increasing over the last, call it 5 to 10 years. We're starting to see what I would call a little bit of a plateau with the usage of relative TSR, and companies really thinking about it because they may have had some negative experiences related to the fact that it's not really, it's an output. It's not in the direct control of management. Getting the comparator group right can be challenging, and again, you have that inefficiency from an accounting perspective. But shareholders love it. Other things to think about, 162M, again, I think we've touched on that enough. Options and performance vested stock options, or performance vested shares, are qualifying there as performance-based. Restricted stock does not. Change of control, going back to that question from the audience earlier, is a huge issue in terms of what's going to vest, what are the conditions under which it will vest. We've seen practices evolve over time where now double triggers are predominant in the market, which means not only does the change of control have to take place, but there needs to be a loss of your job as well. When in the past, single trigger was pretty common, which was just the change of control itself had to take place, not a loss of job. But we've definitely seen that change over time. Benefits and perquisites, there's not a whole lot going on here. Companies have gotten rid of most of the irritants, and usually what's remaining now for proxy officers and what we're seeing in the public company space is that perks are there that support health and productivity of the executives. Besides the corporate aircraft issue, which most CEOs will tell you you're going to take that away, pry it away from their dying hands. That's the one there that has the most stickiness, I would say, in terms of prevalence here. But even that is less than a majority if you look at a good section of companies. SERPs we're not seeing very much in terms of new, so these are retirement plans focused on just senior executives. That being said, excess or restoration plans, which just remove the cap from a qualified plan in terms of the compensation that's allowed to be covered, those are fine. We haven't seen really any change there, and we have seen tremendous movement in terms of decline in severance multiples, elimination of excise tax gross-ups related to 280G, so change of control, and double triggers again. I know we only have a few minutes. I want to just touch on a few important governance policies. Stephen's going to take you through.
Yeah, just really quickly on share ownership guidelines. This is basically the level of stock ownership that you're going to require from your executives. This is defined as a multiple of base salary, so again, going back to that salary playing a big part. We typically see that CEOs have something like a 6 times base salary that gets viewed as robust, and the requirements for direct reports would range from 1 to 3 times base salary. You generally count shares that are owned outright as well as that unvested service-based restricted stock. Generally, you would not find unvested options, or really any options, and unvested performance shares counting towards that number. And the only last thing to note here is that before an executive reaches that goal, it's not uncommon for a company to require them to hold on to a certain percentage of after-tax shares after they vest so that they make their way towards that goal. On the next slide, again, just kind of run through Clawbacks a little quick here. This is the idea where if there's a financial restatement and the bonus that was paid out should have been lower than what was actually paid, the company will go after that additional bonus from the executives. It's included in the Dodd-Frank Act that, but has been delayed in implementation. There is a potential that it'll get repealed under the new administration, but so far we haven't heard anything on it. A lot of companies have already had their own plans set up, mainly for good governance practices, not in terms of reacting to Dodd-Frank. Most of these plans are probably going to have to be revised after if Dodd-Frank regulation gets passed, because there are differences in what types of performance restatements would trigger a clawback, as well as how long-term incentives are viewed and how they would be treated under a Dodd-Frank compliant clawback. So we're looking for additional movement in that as the SEC figures out what they're doing.
And finally, to leave you before any closing questions we may have, we're going to leave you with a bit of a cliffhanger. What you see here are 3 Dodd-Frank compensation-related regulations, the first one of which you've probably heard a lot in the press regarding CEO pay ratio. This is the disclosure that would require the company to disclose a median pay of its employee. So pick out the median employee, provide that pay, which has never been disclosed anywhere before, and also disclose that as a ratio to the CEO total compensation. These ratios are out there and have been calculated in general by various organizations. However, we have not seen specific company disclosures. It is required for the 2018 proxy, absent some sort of legislative repeal. The other two regulations here, pay for performance disclosure and hedging policy, have been sitting here in limbo since 2015, similar to the clawback issue. We have a law that has passed the House. It's called the Financial Choice Act, which was approved in June. You know, prognosticators are saying it's not going to pass the Senate without any sort of significant modification. But as of now, it's on the proposed and approved through the Senate is would repeal the pay ratio and other compensation related to Dodd-Frank, including even annual say on pay. So stay tuned, and we'll try and keep you updated on where the regulations shake out. And we're happy to take any other questions. I know we're running up on the end of our time here, and we want to be thoughtful for taking all of your time today.
Yes, and we still have a big audience online, so we'll take a few more questions. I know we've run over. Please feel free to type any more questions in. Any questions that we don't get to, we will definitely provide an answer to you via email. Next question, can you talk about the interplay between financial objectives and less objective MBOs in annual incentives? How have you guided on accurately assessing these?
That's a challenge that a lot of our clients are dealing with. So, and it's a little different depending on who you're talking about within the organization. For the CEO, many companies have taken the tack that it's going to be 100% financial, and the other MBOs are just part of being a CEO. If there are individual performance criteria, it tends to be things that are specific and no more than 20 or 25% of the total bonus opportunity. For executives below the CEO, you're more likely to see 25% or so in individual performance. And I think the important thing to understand is that if you're not clear in terms of what is going to result in performance and how you define what you're measuring, it will be viewed as a slush fund, and that is going to be problematic when you're talking to your shareholders or when proxy advisory firms are trying to understand what you're doing.
Great. So what we'll do is we'll take one more question, and then we will share the Q&A session with everybody online. We will be sharing a copy of the presentation as well as a copy of the recording, and again, a copy of the question and answer session too. So last question, do you see a common approach in terms of what metrics are applied where PSUs are provided?
I think that, again, it varies. I think total shareholder return is the darling of the ISSs and Glass Lewis's in the world. And you definitely see a large percentage of these PSU plans that are focused 100% on relative total shareholder return. They typically use something like percentile ranking for their threshold, target, and maximum performance. If you step away from the total shareholder return, I think the other big ones would be earnings over the 3-year period. And in those situations, it's not uncommon to find that the performance period is sort of broken up into 3 one-year periods where maybe there's a bit of, it's a little easier to do goal setting than to set up a cumulative 3-year, operating income number that has to be achieved. That can sometimes be problematic.
And one potential pitfall here, and to think about, if you're using the same metrics for your short-term plan and your long-term plan, you're going to get some negative feedback in terms of what is being called double dipping. So, basically getting paid out under two separate plans for the same metric. So we usually advise our clients that they use different metrics for long-term than what they're using for short-term. Long-term, in addition to earnings, which is usually some sort of compound annual growth rate and TSR that we've talked about a lot, we're seeing increasing number of companies look at return measures, return on capital, return on assets, return on capital employed, ROIC, are increasingly being used as a way to not focus on stock price, but try and get to the underlying drivers of what's really going to move the price.
Great. Well, I just wanted to close out the session. Thank you, Joe and Stephen. Great presentation. We've already gotten feedback, very helpful. And I wanted to thank our audience for staying with us even after the 2 o'clock hour. Again, we will be sending over the Q&A session, questions and answers, via email, along with the video presentation and a copy of the slides. I will be keeping the question and answer the meeting open for a while, so if anybody has any other questions that they want to input now, please feel free to do so. I'll keep that open for the next 10 minutes. And thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience, for attending today. Thanks, Joe and Steve.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Leslie. It was a great presentation.